The night Emily Carson disappeared was one of those Ohio evenings that seemed to swallow sound. The fields outside Fairfield lay silent under a pale harvest moon, and the air smelled faintly of rain and engine oil from the nearby highway. Emily, a mother of two, had just clocked out from her shift at the Red Fox Diner, a quiet spot off Route 37 where truckers and locals traded stories over burnt coffee. She waved goodnight to her co-workers, her tired smile hiding something no one noticed until it was too late. Before we uncover how this small-town mystery unraveled after nearly 20 years, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that defy all expectations. It was 11:47 p.m. when Emily's car was last seen leaving the diner parking lot, a blue sedan aging but clean with 2 car seats in the back. By morning, it was found on a rural road leading toward Mill Creek, the driver's door open, keys dangling from the ignition. The engine was cold. No sign of Emily. No footprints in the dirt. Only her purse on the passenger seat and her phone wedged between the seats as if dropped mid-motion. Detective Sarah Monroe was 23 then, new to the Fairfield Police Department, still learning when to listen and when to doubt. The case landed on her desk before she even had her own office. The chief, Harold Briggs, handed her the file with a sigh. "She's probably just left, Sarah. Happens more than you think." But Sarah had seen the look on Tom Carson's face that morning. Shocked, sleepless, trembling as he sat in the station lobby, his kids with their grandmother, he kept repeating, "Emily wouldn't just leave, not her, not the kids." His voice cracked every third word, and Sarah believed him. The search began within hours, patrol cars sweeping the back roads, volunteers combing the fields with flashlights. They found tire tracks that went nowhere, and a single button from a diner uniform caught on a fence wire. It was too little, too random. Still, Sarah kept that button in a plastic bag on her desk for months. Rumors spread faster than the investigation could keep up. Some said Emily ran away with a trucker, others whispered she'd been having trouble at home. Fairfield was small, everyone knew everyone, and secrets didn't stay buried long except this one. Sarah drove that road every day for weeks after the search ended. She'd park near where the car had been found, engine humming, listening to the wind move through the trees. Each gust felt like an unfinished sentence, something just out of reach. Years later, when reporters asked her why she never let the case go, she always answered the same way. Because she was a mother. And mothers don't just disappear. That night, in 2006, marked the start of a silence that settled over Fairfield, heavy and unbroken. No one knew then that the truth would stay hidden for nearly 2 decades, or that when it finally surfaced, it would shake the town to its core. Morning broke over Fairfield, with a sky the color of wet steel. The hum of distant tractors mixed with police radios crackling through the quiet. Detective Sarah Monroe stood beside Emily Carson's abandoned car, notebook in hand, feeling the chill of dew through her shoes. The road curved away into empty farmland. No witnesses, no cameras, just miles of corn and the soft sound of wind brushing against leaves. Officer Grant waved her over. "No signs of a struggle," he said, glancing toward the open door. "It's like she vanished into thin air." Sarah hated that phrase. Nothing ever vanished into thin air. There was always a reason, always a moment someone missed. By noon, Fairfield buzzed with rumors. At the diner, customers whispered over their pancakes. At the elementary school, teachers checked attendance lists uneasy. Local news vans began circling town, turning a family tragedy into a headline. Mother of 2 missing in Fairfield County. At the station, Sarah met Tom Carson again. He sat slumped in a chair, eyes red, voice hoarse. "She worked late sometimes, but she always called," he said quietly. "Last night she said she'd be home by midnight." He looked up at Sarah, desperate. "She didn't even take her wallet." Sarah flipped through her notes. "When was the last time you spoke to her before that call?" He hesitated. "Dinner. We argued a little. Nothing serious. Just bills, the kids' school. She was tired." Detective Monroe noted his pause but didn't push yet. Across the room, Chief Briggs leaned against his office door, watching. "Keep it simple," he had warned her earlier. "Husband's the first to look at, but don't turn this into a circus." The next 48 hours blurred. Search teams combed the woods. K9 units followed faint trails that ended near the creek. A volunteer found a diner receipt from that night, but nothing else matched. Sarah interviewed co-workers, waitresses in faded aprons who swore Emily seemed normal, maybe a little distracted. One recalled seeing a pickup parked across the street just before closing. The detail lodged itself in Sarah's mind like a splinter. Days passed. Reporters camped outside the Carson home, cameras flashing whenever Tom stepped outside. Some neighbors offered casseroles and prayers, others whispered behind curtains, convinced they knew what had happened. Fairfield had a way of folding tragedy into gossip, dressing it as concern. Inside the precinct, the investigation hit its first wall. The fingerprint on the car door belonged to Emily. No foreign prints, no DNA, no witnesses. Chief Briggs sighed as he closed the case folder. "Sometimes people just walk away," he muttered. Sarah stayed late that night, staring at the map tacked to her board, pins marking Emily's last known movements. "She didn't walk away," she whispered to herself. The clock ticked toward midnight, echoing like a reminder of the moment everything stopped. As she finally left the station, the town seemed to sleep under a blanket of fog. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone was still awake, watching, waiting, holding on to a truth no one else could see. Autumn settled over Fairfield like a slow exhale. Leaves turned the color of rust and gold, drifting across the same roads that had once been filled with search teams. Weeks had passed since Emily Carson's disappearance, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the initial panic. The posters stapled to telephone poles began to fade, edges curling under rain and time. Detective Sarah Monroe sat at her desk, the case file open before her. Each page seemed emptier than the last: interview transcripts, phone records, photographs of tire marks that led nowhere. She had memorized every word, every face, every unanswered question, yet the more she looked, the less she found. The chief's voice echoed from their last meeting. "We've done what we can, Monroe. Sometimes you have to let it go." Letting go wasn't something she knew how to do. She caught herself visiting the diner on quiet nights, sitting in the same booth where Emily once served coffee. The waitress, new, younger, with a nervous smile, would ask, "You want the usual, detective?" And Sarah would nod, though she never finished her drink. The air there always smelled of old grease and nostalgia, as if the walls themselves remembered. Tom Carson rarely spoke to the police anymore. When Sarah saw him at the grocery store one Sunday, he looked thinner, his face drawn. "Any news?" he asked, voice flat. She hesitated before shaking her head. His shoulders dropped and he turned away without another word. The children were with him, Lily clutching a cereal box, Ben trailing behind, quiet and distant. Watching them, Sarah felt the familiar sting of helplessness. Inside the department, talk of the case faded. New crimes replaced old mysteries, and Emily's name became a ghost that hovered only in Sarah's mind. Still, every time the phone rang late at night, she half expected it to be a tip, a lead, something to pull her back into motion. It never was. Rachel Myers, Emily's best friend, refused to stop calling. "You promised you'd find her," she reminded Sarah during one of their many tense conversations. "You said you wouldn't let her become another file." Sarah closed her eyes, hearing the tremor in Rachel's voice. "I haven't stopped," she whispered. "I just don't know where else to look." By winter, the case was officially listed as inactive. Sarah cleared her board, but she couldn't bring herself to remove the photo pinned in the center. Emily smiling beside her two children, sunlight in her hair. That image haunted her dreams, a reminder of what she hadn't done, of who she'd failed. Sometimes she drove past the creek at night, headlights sweeping over the empty roadside. She'd pull over, sit in silence, and listen to the rush of water beneath the bridge. It sounded almost like a whisper, one she couldn't quite understand. When spring came again, Fairfield had already moved on, but Sarah carried the case like a scar beneath her uniform. She didn't know then that time would bring it back to her doorstep years later, demanding an answer she still wasn't ready to face. The year 2021 brought a different kind of quiet to Fairfield. The town had grown, new subdivisions stretching across what once were empty cornfields. but the air still carried the same weight when the nights turned cold. Detective Sarah Monroe was now 38, with lines of fatigue beneath her eyes and a reputation built on persistence. Yet every time she opened the cabinet labeled cold cases, her hand paused over one folder, the one with Emily Carson's name printed in fading ink. 15 years hadn't dulled her curiosity, only sharpened it. Technology had changed everything: DNA analysis, digital forensics, even the way cases were catalogued. The Ohio Bureau of Investigation had launched a new initiative to review unsolved disappearances, pairing local detectives with forensic consultants. That's how Daniel Ruiz entered Sarah's life, a methodical, quiet man from Columbus with a background in cold case reconstruction. He arrived with a laptop full of software and a conviction that nothing was truly lost, only misread. "Every case leaves a fingerprint," Daniel said during their first meeting, scrolling through scanned evidence photos. "We just have to know where to look." Sarah smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's never met Fairfield bureaucracy." He chuckled. "I've met worse." Together they began re-examining what little remained: crime scene photos, transcripts, the fragment of fabric found near the fence, Emily's cell phone records. Each item was logged again, tested again, this time with technology that hadn't existed in 2006. When Daniel mentioned the possibility of trace DNA from the car's interior, Sarah felt something stir inside her that she hadn't allowed in years: hope. Chief Briggs, now older and grayer, wasn't as enthusiastic. "That case has been closed longer than some of our rookies have been alive," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're chasing ghosts." Sarah met his eyes. "Maybe. But I owe this one a second look." Briggs sighed, the kind of sigh that came from years of seeing more loss than answers. "Just don't drag the department into another media circus." But Fairfield's media had long forgotten Emily Carson. Her name was a relic, a local legend whispered in the diner between bites of pie. Only Rachel Myers, Emily's friend, still marked the date each year, posting the same message on social media. 15 years, and we still don't forget. Sarah called her one evening after pulling the old files. "Rachel, I'm reopening it," she said quietly. "We've got new tools now, maybe we'll find something." There was a pause, followed by a trembling breath. "You really think so? I wouldn't start if I didn't." Outside, the sky darkened over the town, and rain began to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. Sarah watched it streak down the window of her office and thought about how easily years could wash away, leaving only what was anchored deep enough to resist. For the first time in a long while, she felt the case waking up again, like a sleeping voice whispering through time. "Look closer." The following week, Sarah stood in front of a small brick auto shop on the edge of Fairfield. The sign above the garage read, "Carson Automotive." Letters faded by years of sunlight and snow. She hadn't seen Tom Carson since that grim winter 15 years earlier. Now, as she stepped through the open bay door, the sound of a wrench clattering to the floor broke the quiet. Tom turned, wiping grease from his hands. His hair was thinner, beard streaked with grey, but his eyes were the same, tired, searching, guarded. "Detective Monroe," he said slowly. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." Sarah nodded. "I'm reviewing Emily's case. Some new forensic methods might help us re-examine what was missed." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Missed? You mean everything?" She held his gaze. "I'm sorry for how it went back then. We didn't have what we needed. Maybe now we do." Tom looked away, his jaw tightening. "After all this time, what difference will it make? She's gone and everyone's already decided what they wanted to believe." "Truth still matters," Sarah said quietly. He studied her for a long moment, before nodding toward the office. "Come on, let's talk." Inside, the walls were covered with photos. Tom with his children, birthdays, graduations. Lily and Ben were adults now, their smiles older but familiar. Sarah felt a pang as she looked at them. Tom noticed. "They barely remember her," he said softly. "Sometimes I wish I didn't either, but then I hate myself for thinking that." Did anything strange happen before she disappeared? Sarah asked. Calls, visitors, arguments? Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. I told you everything back then, but... He hesitated. She'd been quiet those last few weeks. Distant. I thought she was just tired from work. Did she ever mention wanting to leave town? He frowned. No, she loved those kids too much. Whatever happened, it wasn't by choice. When Sarah left the shop, the afternoon sky had turned a pale grey. The air smelled faintly of rain and oil, like memory itself refusing to fade. She sat in her car, replaying his words, the same hollow grief echoing beneath them. That evening she met with Rachel Myers at the diner, the same booth they used to share during the first investigation. Rachel looked almost the same, her hair shorter, her expression still fierce with loyalty. You really think you'll find something? She asked, stirring her coffee. I have to try, Sarah replied. Even if it's just to know where she went. Rachel's eyes glistened. You know what still hurts? People stopped saying her name, like forgetting is easier than not knowing. Outside, lightning flickered over the horizon, a storm gathering. Sarah looked out the window and said softly, Then let's remind them. The storm broke before she reached her car. Rain came down in sheets, drumming against the roof as she sat behind the wheel. Somewhere in that rhythm, beneath the sound of thunder, she felt it again, the case stirring back to life, old wounds opening with the promise of something buried, waiting to be found. 2 days later, Daniel Ruiz arrived at Sarah's desk holding a cardboard evidence box covered in dust. You're not going to believe where I found this, he said, setting it down carefully. Old storage closet behind the records room. Looks like no one's touched it since 2006. Sarah frowned. That's impossible. Everything from the Carson case was logged and boxed years ago. Apparently not this, Daniel replied, prying the lid open. Inside lay a stack of tapes labeled with faded marker, security footage from the diner, gas station, and nearby streets. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. For 15 years, they'd believed the footage from that night had been lost in a flood that damaged the evidence locker. She picked up one of the tapes, dated the night Emily disappeared. Let's see what 15 years of dust has been hiding. They loaded the footage into the department's archive player. Static filled the screen before the picture steadied, grainy, black and white. The timestamp read October 17, 2006, 11:42 p.m. Emily's blue sedan appeared, headlights bright as it pulled from the diner lot. She waved goodnight to someone off-screen. Wait, Daniel said, pausing the tape. Who's that near the corner? A figure emerged from the shadows. A man standing by a pickup truck parked across the street. The angle was poor, his face obscured by the brim of a cap. He stepped toward the sedan just before Emily drove away. Sarah leaned forward, breath shallow. Zoom in, she whispered. Daniel adjusted the frame, pixel by pixel. The man's posture was familiar, broad shoulders, uniform-like jacket. Could be anyone, Daniel murmured, but Sarah wasn't convinced. There was something deliberate in the way he watched her car leave. They continued the footage until the screen faded to black. The timestamp stopped exactly 3 minutes before Emily's car was discovered on the rural road. Sarah leaned back, silent. Someone knew her routine, she said finally. He waited until she was alone. Daniel nodded. We'll enhance it. See if we can match the silhouette to old personnel records or locals from that time. As they left the room, Sarah's mind raced. She thought about how many times she'd stared at reports that told her nothing, and now, after all these years, a silent image threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. That night, she drove home through the dark streets of Fairfield. Storefronts were closed, the diner's sign flickering against the drizzle. The same road stretched ahead, unchanged since that October night long ago. At a red light, she found herself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see Emily's case file there, as it had been so many nights before. But this time she didn't feel the same hollow ache. She felt movement, subtle, like the earth shifting beneath old ground. For the first time, something real existed, a clue, a glimpse of truth waiting beneath the static of forgotten evidence. Sarah whispered to herself, it was never lost. Someone made sure it disappeared. and deep down she already knew. The truth wasn't hiding far away. It had been right there all along, waiting for someone stubborn enough to look again. The following morning, Sarah and Daniel gathered at the precinct conference room, the glow of the enhanced footage illuminating the wall. The image was clearer now. The pickup truck parked near the diner, the man's outline sharper, though his face still lost in the blur of grainy pixels. His jacket had a patch on the shoulder, faint but visible under the flickering light. Daniel zoomed in again. "See that?" he said, pointing. "That's not a brand logo. It looks like an emblem, something official." Sarah stared at it, her pulse quickening. "Could be local enforcement," she muttered, "or security. Maybe even—" She stopped herself, unwilling to finish the thought. They decided to re-interview everyone who had worked at the Red Fox Diner in 2006. Most had long since moved on, but a few still lived nearby. That afternoon, they met a former cook named Jerry Whitmore, who now ran a small repair shop outside town. His memory was sharper than Sarah expected. "I remember that night," Jerry said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emily closed early. Said she wasn't feeling right. She argued with someone outside before leaving, some guy in a truck. I figured it was her husband." "Did you get a good look at him?" Sarah asked. "Not really. I was taking trash out the back. But the truck, it had those old-style spotlight mounts, like the ones cops used to have." Sarah exchanged a look with Daniel. "You're sure?" "Pretty sure," Jerry said, shrugging. "You never forget the shape of those lights. You used to see them all over Fairfield back then." After leaving the shop, Sarah drove through town in silence. Fairfield had changed, yet the same narrow roads and familiar houses lined the streets. The memories felt tangible, ghosts of conversations, the faces of people who had once filled those places. Emily's voice seemed to echo in her mind, laughter caught somewhere between memory and guilt. As dusk settled, Sarah and Daniel reviewed a list of former local officers and security personnel from 2006. One name caught Sarah's eye. Officer Raymond Holt, retired. His personnel file mentioned a grey pickup registered under his name that same year. Her hands trembled slightly as she circled it. "Could be coincidence," Daniel said softly, though doubt colored his tone. "Or not," Sarah replied. "We'll find out." Before the day ended, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was from Rachel Myers. Her voice was uneasy. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Back when Emily disappeared, she told me she was scared. Not of Tom, not of leaving, of someone watching her. I thought she was just exhausted. Maybe she wasn't." Sarah felt a chill. "Did she say who?" "No," Rachel whispered. "Only that she couldn't go to the police." The line went quiet for a moment, heavy with realization neither wanted to say aloud. When Sarah hung up, she looked again at the image of the man by the truck, the shape of the patch on his arm, the way he lingered just long enough to be remembered. Something inside her shifted. The past was no longer still. It was breathing again, and every breath carried the scent of something that had been waiting 15 years to be found. The next morning, Sarah entered the precinct with the image of that truck still burned into her thoughts. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the diner footage over and over, the silhouette, the badge-shaped patch, the uneasy timing of it all. When she reached her desk, Daniel was already there, his face tense. "You're going to want to see this," he said quietly, handing her a printed still from the enhanced video. The patch was clearer now. It wasn't just any insignia. It matched the Fairfield Police Department emblem from the early 2000s. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's throat tightened. "That means the man at the diner, he was one of ours." Daniel nodded. "Or someone posing as one. But I checked. There were only 4 patrol officers on duty that night. 2 were accounted for by dispatch logs. The 3rd was responding to a call across town." Sarah's eyes moved down the list. One name remained. Officer Raymond Holt. They both knew what that meant. Holt had retired in 2008, quietly, after 25 years on the force. He'd been respected, the kind of officer who mentored rookies and organized charity drives. But there had always been rumors, stories whispered at the bar about temper, about cutting corners on cases. Sarah swallowed hard. "We can't take this to Briggs yet," she said. "Not without proof." "He'll shut it down before it starts." Daniel hesitated. "You think he'd cover it up?" She didn't answer. The chief had been Holt's partner once. Loyalty ran deep in Fairfield, sometimes deeper than justice. That afternoon, Sarah slipped into the archives room and pulled Holt's personnel file. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she flipped through the yellowing pages. Commendations, performance reports, and then a note buried at the back. Temporary suspension pending internal review, September 2006. The reason was vague. Unprofessional conduct during off-duty hours. The date stopped her cold. It was 1 month before Emily disappeared. Daniel looked over her shoulder. "That can't be coincidence." Sarah's voice was low. "No, it can't." They copied the file and left quietly. But as they returned to the bullpen, Sarah noticed the door to the chief's office slightly ajar. Through the crack, she caught Briggs on the phone. His tone was sharp, defensive. "I told you to keep that sealed. We're not dragging that case through the mud again." Sarah froze, listening. "If Monroe's digging, she needs to be reminded who runs this department." Her stomach twisted. She stepped back, heart pounding, and Daniel's eyes met hers. Neither said a word until they were outside. "He knows," Daniel whispered. "Yeah," Sarah replied, voice steady but cold. "And that means we're on our own." They walked toward their cars in silence, the late afternoon sun bleeding through thin clouds. The air smelled faintly of rain again, familiar, foreboding. As Sarah drove away, the radio played softly, the hum of static between stations filling the quiet. For 15 years, the truth had been buried under paperwork and loyalty. Now it was surfacing, slowly, dangerously, and she knew that every step closer meant pulling against people who'd once sworn to protect the same justice she still believed in. The next evening, Sarah met Rachel at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The place smelled of cinnamon and old coffee, and the hum of conversation softened the weight between them. Rachel looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred sugar into her cup. "You said you found something," she murmured. "About that night." Sarah nodded carefully. "We found footage. Someone near the diner before Emily disappeared. Someone wearing a police patch." Rachel's eyes widened. "A cop?" "We're not sure yet," Sarah replied. "But I need to ask you something I should have asked a long time ago. What exactly did Emily say to you before she vanished?" Rachel stared at the table, silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was fragile. "She was scared, Sarah. I didn't understand how much. She said she couldn't go home that night, that someone had been following her for weeks." Sarah leaned forward. "Did she tell you who?" Rachel shook her head. "No names, just that she didn't trust the police anymore. She said someone from the department was watching her. I thought she was imagining things, stress maybe. I told her to get some rest." Her voice cracked. "She asked if she could stay with me. I said no, I had my daughter that weekend. I told her we'd talk Monday." She never made it to Monday. Guilt flooded the space between them. Sarah felt her chest tighten. "You didn't know," she said softly. "I should have listened," Rachel whispered. "She tried to tell me she was leaving town. Said she'd met someone who promised to help her start over, get away from whatever was scaring her. I thought it was nonsense." "Leaving town," Sarah repeated, frowning. "Did she have a plan?" Rachel nodded faintly. "She said she had a small savings hidden, enough for a bus ticket to Pittsburgh, but she never packed a bag. I checked her house after she went missing. Everything was still there." Sarah sat back, trying to piece the fragments together. A police officer, fear, plans to leave. Nothing about it felt like coincidence anymore. "Rachel, why didn't you tell us this back then?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was afraid too. The week after she disappeared, someone called my house. They didn't speak, just breathed into the phone. Once, I thought I heard the sound of a police radio in the background. I told myself it was paranoia, but I knew." Sarah's pulse quickened. "So you still have that number?" "I wrote it down somewhere," Rachel said, wiping her face. "I'll find it." When Sarah left the cafe, night had already fallen. The streetlights glowed through thin fog, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She leaned against her car, breathing deeply, the cold air biting her lungs. Rachel had carried that secret for 15 years, a truth buried under guilt and fear. Now Sarah understood why Emily's voice had gone silent. She hadn't simply vanished, she'd been cornered, and the person who did it had been closer than anyone dared to believe. 3 weeks after the cafe meeting, the call came from a construction site outside Fairfield. A crew had been digging near the old Mill Creek woods to lay foundations for new housing. When the foreman spotted what looked like bone fragments, he called the sheriff's office. Within hours, the site was sealed off with tape, and Sarah was on her way there, heart pounding against her ribs. The autumn air was brittle, filled with the scent of damp soil and diesel. She walked toward the excavation pit where Daniel waited, his face pale. "We found her," he said quietly. Sarah froze. "You're sure?" "Too early to confirm," he replied, voice strained. "But the location, the personal items, it all fits. Necklace, locket, everything." She stepped closer. The ground had given up its secret after 15 years. A shallow grave, barely 3 feet deep, had preserved what time tried to erase. Among the remains, an old silver locket glimmered faintly under the floodlights. Sarah recognized it immediately from the photos. Tom had mentioned it during the first investigation, a birthday gift engraved with 2 names, Lily and Ben. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. The sound of her heartbeat filled the silence until her knees threatened to give way. "She was here," she whispered, "all this time." Daniel rested a hand on her shoulder. "We'll handle this carefully. DNA will confirm, but it's her." Word spread quickly through Fairfield. News vans appeared before the day ended, headlights piercing through the evening mist. Reporters camped by the road as locals gathered in hushed disbelief. Some cried, others watched from their cars, unwilling to face the truth they'd buried alongside their memories. Sarah avoided the cameras. Inside her office that night, she stared at the recovered evidence laid neatly on her desk. Fragments of clothing, jewelry, a rusted keychain. Each item was a piece of a woman's final moments. For years, the mystery had felt abstract, distant. Now it had a weight, a smell, a shape. Tom Carson arrived at the station just before midnight. He looked older than ever, shoulders heavy with something beyond grief. When Sarah told him they'd found Emily, his lips trembled but no sound came out. He lowered his head into his hands, shaking. "She didn't deserve this," he whispered. "No," Sarah said softly. "She didn't." He lifted his gaze, eyes wet and hollow. "You'll find who did this?" She met his stare and nodded once. "I will." When he left, Sarah sat alone in the dim office. Outside, thunder rolled across the distance. She thought of Emily's last night, her fear, her silence. The evidence had spoken, but quietly, as if it still held its breath, waiting for the full story to emerge. Daniel knocked lightly on the door. "We're sending everything to the lab tonight. DNA rush order." Sarah nodded. "And when it comes back?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Then we find out whose shadow she was running from." Sarah leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time, there was no denying it anymore. Emily Carson's voice had returned, and it was demanding justice. The lab results arrived 3 days later, sealed in a plain manila envelope that seemed far too ordinary for what it carried. Sarah opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she scanned the printed pages. The DNA confirmed what they already knew. The remains belonged to Emily Carson. But what stopped her heart wasn't that confirmation. It was the secondary finding. A partial DNA sample recovered from a fragment of fabric near the remains matched an unidentified male profile, one that had recently been cross-referenced through a state database. Daniel read over her shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. "The match is from a former law enforcement officer, Raymond Holt." Sarah stared at the name, feeling the air leave her lungs. "It's him," she said. "It has to be." Daniel frowned. "It's only a partial match. We'll need corroboration, more evidence before it holds in court." She nodded, but her thoughts were already racing. The footage, the patch, the timing, All of it pointed the same way. For 15 years she had chased shadows. Now the shadow had a name, a uniform, and a history buried behind commendations. They spent the next hours combing through Holt's old case reports. Most were routine, but one detail stood out, a series of patrol logs from the week Emily disappeared. His shift hours didn't match the official dispatch records. On paper, he'd been on duty across town, yet his vehicle GPS had recorded movement toward Mill Creek. Sarah's pulse quickened. "He was there," she said. "He lied about his location." Daniel looked uneasy. "You realize if we push this, we'll be going straight through Briggs. He signed off on those reports." "I don't care," Sarah replied. "We're not stopping now." That afternoon, she requested access to Holt's retirement address through the state database. He lived just outside Columbus, in a quiet suburb, a modest home with a neatly trimmed lawn and a flag by the porch. The thought of him there, living peacefully while a family mourned, made Sarah's stomach twist. Before confronting him, she went to see Chief Briggs. He sat behind his desk, hands folded, the lines on his face deeper than before. "You've been busy," he said, his tone calm but wary. "I have evidence connecting Holt to Emily Carson's death," Sarah said steadily. "DNA, inconsistencies in his logs. He was there." Briggs didn't flinch. He leaned back, exhaled slowly. "You don't understand what you're walking into. Holt was a good cop, a flawed one maybe, but not a murderer. The department doesn't need this kind of noise." Sarah's voice hardened. "The department doesn't get to decide what the truth sounds like." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then Briggs looked away. "Do what you think you have to, Detective. But remember, when you dig too deep, you don't just find answers, you find enemies." Sarah left his office with a cold determination she hadn't felt since her first year on the force. The DNA didn't lie. Holt had been there. And if Briggs wanted to bury that truth, he'd have to bury her with it. Rain drizzled over Fairfield as dawn broke, the kind of steady, quiet rain that carried the scent of closure and unease. Sarah stood by her car outside the precinct, watching droplets blur the reflection of the badge clipped to her belt. Daniel joined her, holding a folder sealed with the state attorney's approval. "The warrant's official," he said. "We moved today." Sarah nodded. "Where is he?" "Home, Columbus, retired life. Morning walks, church on Sundays, the works." She exhaled slowly, the tension sharp in her chest. "Let's end it." By mid-morning, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled onto a quiet suburban street, lined with maple trees and mailboxes painted with family names. Holt's house sat at the end, a modest brick home, flagpole swaying lightly in the wind. He was in the yard, trimming hedges, wearing an old jacket with the faint outline of his police patch still visible on the sleeve. When Sarah stepped out of the car, Holt turned. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something colder. "Detective Monroe," he said evenly. "Didn't expect company." "Raymond Holt," she said, voice firm. "You're under arrest for the murder of Emily Carson." For a moment, he didn't move. The clippers hung from his hand, water dripping from the blades. "You can't be serious," he said, almost amused. "After all these years, you think you've got something new?" "DNA evidence," Daniel replied. "And the truth you've been running from." Holt's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about. That woman, she wasn't who you thought she was." Sarah stepped closer, eyes unflinching. "Maybe not, but she didn't deserve what happened to her." The silence that followed was broken only by the patter of rain on pavement. Holt's composure cracked. His shoulders sagged as if the years had finally caught up. He didn't resist when Daniel placed the cuffs around his wrists. As they read him his rights, a neighbor peeked through a curtain, then another. The quiet street filled with murmurs as reality sank in. Their former officer, the man who'd once led safety fairs for children, now escorted into the back of a police car. At the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with disbelief. Officers whispered in hallways, heads lowered, eyes avoiding Sarah's. Chief Briggs watched from his office window as they brought Holt inside. When Sarah entered his office, he spoke without turning. "You actually did it." "I did my job," she said simply. He looked at her then, weary but resigned. Fairfield won't be the same after this. Maybe that's the point, she replied. Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in the interrogation room, watching through the glass as Holt waited, hands folded, eyes distant. For years he'd walked among them, a man trusted with the power to protect, while hiding the truth of what he'd taken. Daniel entered quietly. "Media's already all over it," he said. "You're going to be asked for statements." Sarah didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on Holt. "He's not the only one who buried something," she murmured. "The question is, how deep does it go?" The courthouse in Lancaster buzzed with tension the morning the trial began. News vans crowded the square, their antennas reaching into a pale winter sky. Inside, the air was thick with whispers and the click of cameras. For 15 years, the name Emily Carson had been a ghost in Fairfield. Now it filled every headline again, paired with the face of the man accused of silencing her. Sarah took her seat in the back row, her badge clipped discreetly to her belt. She wasn't there as a detective today, but as a witness to the long, painful road that led here. When Holt entered the courtroom escorted by deputies, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. He looked smaller than she remembered, stooped, grey, the weight of exposure hanging over him like an anchor. The prosecution opened with measured precision. For 15 years, the defendant hid behind his badge, the attorney said. He used the trust of his community to conceal a crime that shattered a family. Tom Carson sat in the front row, his children beside him. Lily held her brother's hand, tears glistening in her eyes as the photographs appeared on the screen, the diner, the road, the silver locket. Sarah caught Tom glancing back at her once, a faint nod of gratitude passing between them. Then Rachel Myers took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. "Emily told me she was afraid," she said. "She said someone was following her, and she didn't feel safe going to the police." The defense attorney objected, but the judge allowed her to continue. Rachel looked straight at Holt, who kept his gaze fixed on the table. "She trusted people who didn't deserve it," Rachel said, her voice breaking, "and we all paid for that." When Sarah was called to testify, she described the investigation, how the case had gone cold, the rediscovered footage, the DNA match. The defense pressed her relentlessly, trying to sow doubt. "Detective Monroe, you had no direct evidence linking my client to the scene, only a partial match." "Isn't that right?" Sarah met his eyes. "A partial match that led to a man whose lies filled the gaps for 15 years, she said calmly. "The evidence didn't point to him by chance. It pointed to him because he was there." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed to pause. Over the following days, the trial unfolded like an autopsy of the past. Witnesses described Holt's authority, his familiarity with Emily's route home, the unlogged patrol car sightings near Mill Creek. The prosecution's case grew heavier with each detail. By the final arguments, the courtroom felt drained of air. The prosecutor's closing words echoed through the chamber. "Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice waiting for the right hands to find it." When the jury retired, Sarah stepped outside. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes melting on her coat. She looked toward the courthouse steps, where Tom stood alone, his breath visible in the cold. "Whatever they decide," he said quietly, "thank you for not giving up." Sarah nodded. "It was never about giving up," she said. It was about finally being heard. The verdict came on a grey February afternoon. The courthouse was silent as the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Sarah sat motionless, hands clasped tightly in her lap, the faint hum of the overhead lights the only sound she could hear. When the foreman rose, time seemed to slow. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Raymond Holt, guilty of second-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tom closed his eyes, tears slipping silently down his face. Lily clung to her brother's arm, her body trembling with quiet sobs. Holt remained still, jaw set, eyes blank as the judge read the sentence, 25 years to life. The man who once wore the badge of trust now stood condemned by the same justice he'd betrayed. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, microphones flashing like fireflies in the dull light. Sarah declined interviews. She didn't want sound bites. She wanted peace. She stood at the edge of the square, watching as Tom guided his children through the crowd, heads bowed, the weight of 15 years finally lifting. Later that week, Fairfield held a small memorial at the town park, where a new plaque bore Emily's name beneath the words "Never Forgotten." The wind carried the faint scent of spring as people gathered, neighbors, former co-workers, old classmates. Rachel Myers stood beside Sarah, her eyes red but calm. "She'd be proud you never stopped," she said softly. Sarah shook her head. It wasn't pride. It was guilt that turned into purpose. Rachel gave a small smile. "Sometimes that's what justice looks like." When Tom spoke at the memorial, his voice wavered but carried through the still air. "Emily was more than a victim," he said. "She was a mother, a friend, and she trusted the wrong person. But today she's found her voice again." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah lingered by the plaque. The sun broke briefly through the clouds, lighting the engraved letters, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Yet beneath that calm was an ache, an awareness of how much had been lost to silence, to fear, to the slow grind of truth through the gears of power. That evening, Daniel joined her at the diner. The place had changed ownership again, but the smell of coffee and the faint hum of conversation were the same. "You did good," he said, stirring his drink. "We did what was right," Sarah replied. "That's not always the same thing." He studied her for a moment. "You ever think about leaving the department, starting fresh somewhere?" She looked out the window at the dimming horizon. "I thought about it, but there's always another case, another voice, waiting. Fairfield doesn't need fewer people who care. It needs more." As night settled over the town, the lights from the diner glowed against the dark, a small reminder that even in places long shadowed by tragedy, light could still find its way through. Justice had come, imperfect but real, and for Sarah Monroe that was enough to keep her standing. Spring returned to Fairfield quietly, soft rain washing the salt from winter streets. The town, though changed, carried the faint pulse of healing. People no longer lowered their voices when speaking Emily Carson's name. Her story had become something larger, both a warning and a reminder that silence never keeps the peace, it only buries the truth. Sarah Monroe walked along Mill Creek one early morning, the same path that had once haunted her dreams. The air was cool and still, the trees just beginning to bud. She stopped near the clearing where Emily's remains had been found, now marked with a simple wooden cross surrounded by wildflowers. Someone, perhaps Rachel, perhaps Tom, kept it tended. She knelt briefly, brushing her fingers against the damp earth. "We didn't forget," she whispered. "Not this time." Her phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "Cold case unit meeting at 9. New file just came in." Sarah smiled faintly. The work never ended, but she didn't mind anymore. She'd learned that justice wasn't always swift or clean. It was something you built piece by piece, no matter how long it took. Later that day, she stood before a group of new recruits at the Fairfield Police Department. They listened intently as she spoke, her voice steady, shaped by experience. "When I started here, I thought solving cases was about evidence, facts, data, logic, but it's not. It's about people, the ones left behind, the ones who can't speak for themselves. You don't just chase proof, you chase truth, even when it hurts." One young officer raised a hand. "Detective Monroe, what keeps you going when a case feels impossible?" She paused, considering. "You remember their names," she said. "You remember who you're fighting for. That's what keeps you moving." After the session, she found Tom Carson waiting by the station doors. His expression carried both gratitude and fatigue, the kind that comes from years of surviving what can't be undone. "Lily's graduating this spring," he said quietly. "She wants to study criminal justice." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like her mother." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Emily would have liked you, you know. You didn't give up." "She deserved someone who wouldn't," Sarah replied. As Tom left, she watched him walk into the sunlight, a man finally unburdened by suspicion and silence. For the first time in 15 years, the Carson family could exist without shadows. That evening, Sarah returned home and sat by her window, rain tapping softly against the glass. She thought of the years lost, the nights spent chasing ghosts, and the faces of those who never stopped believing. The case had begun as a story of failure, but it ended as one of resilience. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the rain steady her thoughts. Somewhere another truth waited, buried under time and fear, and when it surfaced, she would be there. Because in Fairfield, silence once buried the truth, but courage, patience, and persistence had unearthed it. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe for more stories where truth refuses to stay hidden, and click on the next video on your screen to keep uncovering the power of real-life justice.